This video was made possible by our supporters on Patreon. If you want to join the community and help us reach our next goal, consider making a pledge.
I really don't know much about this war, to be honest. What I know is that the Japanese did some fucking hardcore atrocities, right? They've done some bad shit. I read about yeah, let's not get into detail, but they did some fucking bad shit, dude. Some really bad shit.
Despite the massive death toll and sheer magnitude of the confrontation, the Second Sino-Japanese War is often overlooked as a part of the Second World War. This conflict played a major...
Did he blur out Hitler? I think you have to do that on YouTube, because everything Hitler related gets you instantly demonetized. I think you have to blur out Hitler, man.
...role in deciding the victor of the ongoing Chinese Civil War.
Is he a fencer?
A war that would transform China into the communist state that exists today.
He did KW, you have to, man, otherwise you get demonetized.
And today we'll be exploring the causes and course of the Second Sino-Japanese War. But first, I'd like to say thanks to our sponsors over at Banknote World. I always say...
I have a funny game. Every time a content creator calls out the sponsor, you have to guess what the sponsor is. Banknote World. Has to be an app related to your money? Banknote World. An app about money, I guess.
Say that everyone should have at least
it shows you the current exchange rates.
Indoors or outdoors. One problem with most hobbies, however, is the cost, and so what better place to start for history buffs than with collecting inexpensive currency from all around the globe. Our friends at Banknote World actually sent me some Chinese and Japanese currency from 1944.
Oh, it's about old currency.
This Japanese currency here only costs you about $5 US.
Dude, there's a fucking samurai on it. Holy crap, man.
Extremely easy.
Wow.
You can check out our unique link to their website and YouTube channel in the description below.
What a specific sponsor. Very specific. Collecting certain money and shit. You know what I think is super interesting? In globalism? So the euro in Europe has been around since 2001, I think, right? When I go to the supermarket and I have a handful of coins, I swear to God, almost 50% of the coins are foreign. What the fuck? Right, I go through my coins and Greece, France, like a lot of them, dude. It's really cool how over the years they have mixed, right?
Now back to the topic at hand. To understand the precarious situation that led up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, it is important to mention the events of 19th century China.
Chiang Kai-shek. His name is Shrek or something, right?
The century can be characterized as one of factionalism, lawlessness, foreign intervention by Western powers, and rising nationalist sentiments, which in 1911 culminated in the overthrow of the established Qing dynasty by the Nationalist Republicans, or Kuomintang. This led to intense regionalism across China as warlords took control of small territories that they ruled in
even Turkey's in the mix, Jesus.
Their own name. By the 1920s, the spread of communism led to the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, which was suppressed by the Kuomintang, the leader of which was the cunning Chiang Kai-shek, who subjugated influential warlords in order to secure his rule over China. Soon after, Chiang turned his attention towards the communists, igniting the Chinese Civil War in 1927.
I gotta be dead honest, I know nothing about this era. 1927 China War. No clue, man. Super uninformed about that. I think I once read that Mao got fucked. They beat him all the time, and he was hiding in the mountains. And then when China was busy defending their survival against Japan, he came out of the fucking mountains. He always stole weapons, took over China, and then, oh, look at us. We're so cool, man. We backstabbed millions of Chinese as they tried to survive the Japanese onslaught. But now the communism wins, man. And years later, you have a fucking throne from China that listens to you. Hello? Winnie?
Japan, by contrast, had been relatively isolated for millennia. The island nation had developed a highly militaristic society, and this was intensified after the Emperor of Japan consolidated his power in what was known as the Meiji Restoration, with its population's adherence to warrior and feudal codes translating into a religious devotion to the emperor.
I remember, I read that. The Meiji Restoration was a big thing that fucked the samurai up, because the Meiji Restoration was kind of the emperor saying that all your samurai dumb shit is over I'm the big boss now. Everybody believes in the emperor. Get a gun. There's some like it modernized Japan, but it also meant the end of the samurai. I remember that.
These years of seclusion contributed to the
Tom Cruise
development
told
of
me
a
about this.
xenophobic mentality. The Japanese viewed their culture as the most sophisticated and civilized. This sense of national pride continued to inflate despite increased influence of the West in matters of technology and trade throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The combination of ultranationalism, a centralized state, and European technology allowed Japan, in the First Sino-Japanese War, to
Dude, when I watch this, I want to instantly play Japan in a 4U format.
conquer Korea from the Chinese, whose administrative process and technology paled in comparison. The Japanese would continue to expand throughout the Pacific and onto the East Asian mainland.
So here we go. I know nothing about this shit.
The requirements of both a
need 40
large
whiffs.
population and a large military began to strain the Japanese economy,
Final
causing
pizza?
ever deeper expansion into the Asian mainland. In September of 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which offered ample resources and living space. As justification, Japan cited the Mukden incident, in which elements of the Imperial Japanese Army detonated a small amount of dynamite at a section of the South Manchuria Railway, which had been granted to them in the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese then falsely accused China of sabotage.
The fascists are so often, and have so often been using these tricks, right? These fake war goals on people, acting like they did something they never did. It's kind of like America nowadays.
Despite receiving orders to keep the incident contained at a local level, the Japanese army proceeded
Manchuria has weapons of mass destruction. Let's go.
to capture all of the cities along the South Manchuria Railway.
Like most hardcore
Surprisingly, the
roleplay.
Republic of China maintained a policy of non-resistance, although some Chinese warlords and generals tried to resist, but unsuccessfully. By February of 1932, Japan had control over all of Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, which, interestingly, was governed by the last emperor of China, the 26-year-old Po Yi. The Chinese appealed to the League of
No offense, I don't mean it's offensive, but I'm watching a lot of StarCraft lately, and these young StarCraft players look like Pooji here, man. I swear to God.
Your Japan gameplay.
Same glasses. It's still, this guy was ahead in fashion. They all have the round glasses.
Of Nations in
Thank you,
response.
Son Kil
And
Yor.
after a year-long
Jesus.
investigation, the League concluded that the invasion
Oh,
was
wow.
unjustified, to which Japan simply left the League of Nations.
Hmm.
Chiang Kai-shek was aware that the Japanese interests in China were not over, and so in 1936 he agreed to an alliance with the Communists, putting the Chinese Civil War on hold. Less than 1 year later, the Second Sino-Japanese War would break out in full when, on the 7th of July, Japanese troops conducted a military exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge in Wanping, which startled the Chinese garrison who weren't warned in advance. In the resulting confusion, shots were exchanged, and after the skirmish ended, the Japanese noticed one of their men was missing after a head count. When the Chinese refused to allow them to search the city, the Japanese attacked the city head-on, trying to cross the bridge. On July 20th, Japan
Goddamn.
began bombarding Wanping, and by the end of the month had taken Beijing and the surrounding areas. The Japanese were initially content with the territory they'd taken in northern China and wanted to end the war quickly, but Chiang Kai-shek was not giving up anytime soon. He decided to open up a second front at the city of Shanghai, storming the Japanese quarter of the city on the 13th of August. The fighting around the Shanghai area lasted for a total of 3 months, marked by intense close
Goddamn,
quarters
3
combat.
months.
Shanghai finally fell when an amphibious Japanese force landed in the southern region of the city, which was left undefended. The Chinese took heavy casualties, losing 250,000 men, many of them their highest quality troops, while
Isn't it fucking mental how all these kill numbers are not even close to how many people are losing to Corona right now? But with Corona, like when I hear this, right, 250 people, it's like, oh god, wow. But then you look at the news, oh yeah, fucking thousands died of Corona, and it's just, oh, it's so different, right? The story of a death seems to really matter to our human brains.
the Japanese
Like all
lost
these people dying to
60,000.
Corona are just a
On the
number
8th
to
of
most
November,
people, right?
Chiang ordered
They
his
don't
forces
exist.
to retreat west towards the city of Nanking, the capital of China at the time. The Chinese in Nanking were positioned in elaborate fortifications inside and outside of the city. Despite these defenses, the Japanese had captured the southern portion of the city by December 12th.
Like
which
Stalin said,
prompted
yeah,
Chiang
yeah,
to
don't do the
evacuate
fucking quote,
his
you always
troops
do
from
that.
the city. The Japanese were
I can't do
frustrated
Minecraft
after
review,
what
the
they
guy's not
thought
here.
would be an easy victory. This
During the
frustration
week.
translated into brutality against the civilians who were raped and executed on an immense scale.
That is so fucking mental, man. I read about this shit, man. They were the commanders, the Japanese commanders, couldn't kill the Chinese quick enough, and they always looked for new ways. And like they took a bunch of Chinese people, like hundreds, and put them together with wire, put them together, and then just fucking put the flamethrower on them and shit, man.
The number of casualties ranges from 50,000
There's
to
a lot of mass
300,000.
graves and shit.
The massacre is possibly the defining event in the Second Sino-Japanese
Fucking
War.
mental, dude.
It is possibly one of the single largest atrocities in human history. As such, the event remains one of the primary reasons why, even today, relations between Japan and China are
understandable.
At best somewhat bitter.
Isn't that insane, Alter? Just because a bunch of fucking monkeys make such a crazy decision, it fucks the relations for decades, man. For decades to come. Fully understandable, though. Jesus.
By 1939, the war was beginning to reach a stalemate. The Chinese still refused to surrender despite huge casualties and territorial losses, and had begun to receive much-needed experience and foreign aid. Meanwhile, the
they need 500 experience to get rid of the debuff.
lines of communication were being stretched to
Mao
the limit.
actually thanked Japan for invading. Bullshit, he didn't. He didn't. I don't believe that.
However, Japanese spirits were lifted when their German allies signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, whom the Japanese feared would invade Manchuria and their holdings in northern China. On September 14th, 13 days after
Japan has till this day never apologized.
A Japanese force of 100,000 men attacked the city of Changsha, which was the next major target on the road to Shanghai.
Japan was as bad as the Nazis, but the only reason this wasn't talked as much about is that China became communist after.
Anqing, where the Chinese government had been relocated. A force of 240,000 Chinese soldiers
Japan did apologize,
inflicting more casualties than
not
they
as
had
wanted
sustained.
though.
On October 6th, the Japanese withdrew and allowed the Chinese to regain lost ground in the surrounding areas. Changsha was the first major Chinese city that managed to fight off the Japanese successfully. While the Kuomintang tended to partake in large sweeping operations, their communist allies in the north had mainly opposed the Japanese through insurgency and guerrilla tactics. But under pressure from Chiang Kai-shek, the Communist Party of China began to execute large offensive actions. On the 20th of...
What is that? Well, yes, Mao did thank Japan for invading. In a massive book called The Private Life of Chairman Mao, written by Li Zuixi, a personal doctor and friend of Mao, Li Zuixi does state on page 568 that when Tanaka, aka the Japanese Prime Minister, tried to apologize for his country's invasion of China, Mao assured him that it was the help of the Japanese invasion that made the communist victory and this visit between communist and Japanese leaders possible. Apart from the small amount of evidence in the book, it is very well known that during a speech where Mao welcomes the arriving Japanese politicians in 1961, he says, "In the past, Japanese warlords had occupied a large part of China. Because of that, Chinese people had learned a lesson. Without Japan's invasion, Chinese people would not be awakened, neither could they be united." It's very hard for me to read, man. Jesus. Okay, now don't scroll lower. Yeah, don't show picture. I didn't show picture.
Of August 1940, the CCP gathered 400,000
well, Mao
men
needed this invasion, otherwise he would have never
assaulted numerous
won,
staging
right?
areas and railways, which were defended by 420
Crazy how
Japanese
history works, though. Because the Japanese were so fucked and tried to take it all over, man. They in the end, once again, butterfly effect led to China being what it is today, man.
Japanese forces in what would be called the 100 Regiments Offensive. Although the Japanese and collaborators pushed them back, the communists considered their campaign successful because it resulted in the destruction of about 600 miles of railroad tracks. The remainder of the Second Sino-Japanese War was marked by repeated failed attempts by the Japanese to take various strategic cities. It wasn't until near the end of the Second World War when, on the 9th of August 1945, 3 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and promptly destroyed the primary Japanese army in Manchuria. On the 15th of August, Japan surrendered, ending the Second Sino-Japanese War and ending the occupation of China. Within a year, the Chinese Civil War began again. But that is a story for another day.
Oh, I don't even know anything about that.
As I mentioned before.
Okay. Once again, always big shout out to the channel. Show some love, please. Post the link in the channel.